We're going to be talking about the Remembrance boss weapons today, so obviously there's going to be some spoilers, none of which is going to be like gameplay related, not going to show like locations of bosses from the DLC, so don't worry about that, but obviously being that we're talking about the weapons, I'm going to reference the bosses, so I just thought to let you guys know now. But yes, there are a total of 10 Remembrance weapons, and we're going to be ranking all of them from worst to best based on how well they perform and how useful they are in PvE. Now I'm going to be completely honest, a lot of these weapons are just mid. Like, not necessarily bad, like one of them is pretty bad, but like most of them are just very mediocre. Like to the point where it has like a very specific use or it's just not worth using. So if it seems like I'm going to be doing a lot of complaining in this video, it's because I am. Starting off at number 10, we have the Greatsword of RADAHN Light. This is actually one of two Greatsword of RADAHNs, and both of these weapons are basically the exact same moveset, same range, they look the same scalings, damage values, the only difference being their skills, which I don't know why it wasn't a stance-based skill that had both of them combined into one, but instead we had two different weapons. But yeah, the reason why this one's going to be like the most useless boss weapon is because the other one is the exact same thing, but just gets a better skill, and also this thing just completely sucks. It is just not that good. It is going to be a paired Colossal Sword, of which is going to give you the regular Colossal Sword moveset. Don't know why it didn't get a unique moveset, but it also does get a split magic damage and a very bad intelligence scaling, so it is very comparable to the Star Scourge Greatsword. And the funny thing is, the Star Scourge Greatsword literally outdamages this weapon, even with unoptimized stats. I had a 60 strength and 40 dexterity build using the Greatsword of RADAHN, which yes, it does scale a bit better of strength compared to dexterity. And with these stats, the Star Scourge Greatsword literally gets more damage. And that weapon also gets the exact same moveset, does get a little bit less range, but that one does also gets a really good skill. But this weapon's skill, Light Speed Slash for 32 FP, basically does a whole bunch of nothing. You jump up in the air, come crashing to the ground, do terrible damage, about 20 stance damage. It's just not good. Like, it's to the point that even a regular light attack does more damage than this weapon's skill, and that's obviously going to be quicker, not to consume any FP, and it could do just as much stance damage too. Now you can fully charge the skill to make it do a total of 30 stance damage and make it do a little bit more damage, but it's still not even that good. You're still better off just R1 spamming. And as I mentioned, the Star Scourge Greatsword just gets the exact same moveset, but just with more damage, so just go with that one. And in terms of these holy projectiles that come out afterwards, yes, it is going to be doing pure holy damage, but these things just do awful damage. And I'm pretty sure they scale off the intelligence stats, which this thing is getting a D-scaling in intelligence. So if you actually wanted to get some decent damage out of this holy projectile, you have to spec into a lot of intelligence, use things like the Holy Tear, the Sacred Scorpion Charm, other types of holy buffs, just to really benefit off it. And in that instance, you're basically speccing into a completely different build, because this is a weapon that does magic damage and has a quality scaling. Like, you get this off the final boss, the most complicated boss that From Software has probably ever made, with his crazy-ass over-the-top movesets, and this is the final weapon that we have to show for it. Like, not even a unique light attack combo. Why? Number 9, the POLEBLADE of the Bud. Now, as I was mentioning, a lot of these weapons are just going to be very mediocre, but not necessarily bad, which this falls under that category. It does look good on paper. It gets the Guardian Sword Speed moveset, gets pretty good range for a halberd. It does get slashing damage, which is just going to be better than standard damage in most cases. It does get a good arcane scaling, and it gets passive Scarlet Rot build-up. Now, the major problem of this weapon, Scarlet Rot doesn't actually scale off arcane. And being that this thing has 55 Rot build-up and you're swinging with a halberd, it's going to take a while to actually proc some Rot. And being that this actually has an arcane scaling, you're going to go into an arcane build, of which you could just use something like Rotten Breath. Not only is this going to proc Rot way faster, but it's going to proc a better version of Rot, because Scarlet Rot on weapons only does 15% damage, but for spells it does 30% damage. But being able to do it with a weapon is still going to be nice, and all this would be forgiven if it just had a really high damaging skill, which it does not, because for 24 FP, Ramina's Purification does this very long swinging attack that gets 0 hyper armor that you can get staggered out of straight away. Does basically no damage and only 200 Rot buildup if enemies like stay inside that whole butterfly effect. So it's going to take like a few hits to actually like proc Rot. And for 24 FP every single time that you use it in this really long animation, yeah, it's not going to be worth it. It might be pretty useful to like use it and then dodge back into safety, but it's not like the easiest thing to control. So yeah, like, it has some good things going for it. It still got Scarlet Rot and a good moveset, but like, that's it. Number 8, the Gazing Finger, which is acquired off Mate's Remembrance. Now, this is going to be a strength-based colossal weapon. Does get a little bit of an intelligence scaling and some split magic damage. Colossal weapons, I'm not too big on, tend to have very slow movesets, and if I want some hard-hitting, good stance-breaking options, typically Great Hammers are just going to do that for you anyway. Also, just weigh a lot less and have much more manageable movesets. Sometimes they can even get more stance damage too. But as for the Gazing Finger, it actually is going to be the lightest colossal weapon in the game at 15 units, does get a B scaling and strength at +10, and does get a really bad intelligence and faith-based scaling. It does get a unique heavy attack in this downward slam, is very similar to like the Great Club or the Blood Fiend's arm, but just feels a bit slower. It does get a unique follow-up heavy attack of which you're just staying on the ground on your knee, and then does like another heavy attack. So maybe like some attacks can go over your head. Each attack does do 45 stance damage, which is on the higher end when it comes to colossal weapons. But in terms of its skill, Kowtower's Resentment, for 31 FP, you slam the weapon into the ground, and it does this follow-up wholly damaging AoE. And yes, it does wholly damage. I do not know why. The weapon gets split magic damage, it gets a D-scaling in intelligence, but it gets holy damage for the AoE. And yeah, it is going to scale off your faith stat, and it gets an E scaling in faith, so trying to improve the damage means you have to spec into like a useless stat just to make it work. And it's kind of having you pick and choose between like decent weapon skill damage or good weapon damage. But the skill itself is actually okay, like it goes pretty far when you have it fully charged. The stance damage is not going to be that good. The AoE only does 15 stance damage, whether it's charged or uncharged. When you hit with the weapon directly, only does an additional 7 stance damage. But the distance of which this actually can travel is okay, but it's just so inconvenient to have to spec into. Like, why does it get holy damage? It could have just been magic damage, would have scaled off the intelligence stat, probably would have given this weapon like a C scaling in intelligence, and then there you go, you have like a much better weapon. But instead we get this very confusing weapon with a bunch of scalings that just make no sense. Number 7, the Shadow Sunflower Blossom. This is going to be another colossal weapon. This one also is very light, only at 16 units, very good range, and very high amounts of damage. Does do split physical and holy damage, which yeah, holy damage in this game, specifically in the base game, and some parts of the DLC, is just going to be worse than like all other damage types. So having high amounts of AR with a holy weapon isn't going to mean much, but it does get very good scalings, C in strength and B in faith, and does get the Great Club and the Blood Fiend's arm heavy attack, with the quick downward slam that does do 46 stance damage, which is like the most in the game if you don't include the Blood Fiend's arm AoE attack. And in terms of its skill, Shadow Sunflower Headbutt, it slams the weapon down somewhat similar to like the heavy attack, but has like a longer animation, but does get a lot of hyper armor. The first slam does 20 stance damage, then does get additional follow-up attacks. The next attack will be a double hit that does 15 stance damage, and the last attack will do a total of 30 stance damage, and it ends up doing just as much damage as the first swing. So the entire combo can hit pretty hard, do a total of 65 stance damage. But the problem is with this weapon is that the heavy attack is just going to be better. Like, it has the exact same range. You could do just as much damage, if not even more damage, because there are lots of things that can actually boost heavy attack damage. And most importantly, you're going to be doing way more stance damage. Like, in the time that you get this entire combo off, you could do 2 charged heavy attacks, which is going to do like twice as much stance damage and is more damage in total without consuming any FP. Now, there might be specific circumstances of which you can use the skill because it does get more hyper armor. It does get like a little double swing in between, which might help with the multi-hit talismans, and it could probably stun lock those smaller enemies. But in almost every other instance, I'd rather just use the heavy attack, which is still going to perform fine because it is a good heavy attack and it does get high amounts of AR. But if I were to go into a heavy attack build, there are going to be better options out there. Number 6, the Putrescence Cleaver, which you acquire off the Putrescence Knight. It is going to be a great axe that does get split magic damage and some slash damage. Also gets a strength and arcane scaling with a bit of a frostbite buildup. Now, great axes actually have been buffed to where their charged heavy attacks just do more damage now, which kind of brings them more in line to what great hammers are like, because typically great hammers are always just better because they did just as much damage, but just did way more stance damage. But now this kind of brings them more in line. Now it does just get the regular great axe moveset. Doesn't get any cool like projectile throwing attacks like the boss actually gets, which is very disappointing. Also doesn't get any cool ghost flame attacks either. And the weapon just gets like horrendous and terrible range. I don't know why this thing wasn't like a curved greatsword. I probably would have liked that a bit more. But a slash based great axe is kind of cool. But yeah, in terms of its weapon skill, spinning guillotine, it's just like a worse version of like wild strikes in almost every single way. For 12 FP, you do like this cool jumping attack that slams onto the ground, does do 20 stance damage. You can continually hold onto the button to keep spinning around, and every single hit can like stun lock, can help proc frost, and does an additional 7 stance damage per hit. You can also do a follow-up heavy attack that has you jump again and do another triple swinging attack that does do an additional 30 stance damage, which is pretty nice for the entire combo. But something that can do the exact same job but just way better is like a cold infused great axe that has wild strikes, something like the rusted anchor. It's going to do more damage. It's going to be doing piercing damage. It's going to proc frost way faster as well, because with frost infusions, you get over like 120 frost build up, but with this weapon, you only get 55, which I don't know why that's the case. You can't really improve it either, because Frostbite doesn't actually scale with anything. And Wild Strikes is just like way cheaper, way easier to use, does more damage. The follow-up inputs are just way less risky, and can just do just as much stance damage, sometimes even more. This weapon should have had some like cool throwing boomerang attack, or some cool ghost flame attack, but instead we got this like cheap knockoff of Wild Strikes. Number 5, the RELLANA'S Twin Blades. This is going to be a paired light greatsword, of which the power sensing light grade combos can be very nice, can do some nice damage. They swing very quickly, can help proc the multi-hit talismans very well. Now my biggest issue is that it does consume a lot of stamina, and it doesn't do the damage to like compensate for that stamina cost. I'd much rather just have a two-handed light greatsword every single time, but it's still perfectly serviceable. But the weapon itself is going to be comparable to the Sword of Night and Flame, in that it does get an intelligence and faith-based scaling with magic and fire damage. Now, typically split damage is just bad in general, and having like 3 different damage types is obviously going to be an issue, but being that the damage types are split between 2 different swords, it's not going to be that big as a downside as it is with the Sword of Night and Flame, but I'm still not going to want to use this over the Sword of Night and Flame, because the weapon skill is just nowhere near as good, nor are the scalings. This thing does get C scalings across the board, but the weapon skills only scale off intelligence and faith. Now the skill is going to be a stance, of which the light attacks will do a magic-based projectile attack that shoot out like 5 or 6 different projectiles. They don't really do that good of damage. They can stagger some smaller types of enemies, which will be nice. And if you're trying to clean up some trash mobs, it can be pretty cool. The projectiles do come out somewhat fast, but it is like 10 FP for like every double swing, so it can be somewhat expensive. And the heavy attack is going to summon this cool fire tornado that can stun lock smaller types of enemies, and if you're surrounded by a bunch of trash mobs, it can clean them up very quickly. But the thing is, like, both of these versions are just worse than the Sword of Night and Flame. Like, the magic-based version of the Sword of Night and Flame can just do way more damage. It goes through enemies, it's a quicker cast, and probably a quicker total overall animation compared to like the full combo that you get with the magic-based version with the RELLANA'S Twin Blades, and can just cost less FP too. And in terms of the fire-based version, it can also do just as much damage, but just in a quicker animation. But the projectile can just go further, it's less risky, it's quicker. The only downside is that it consumes 7 more FP, but I'd rather just consume that 7 more FP and actually do good damage. Like, the weapon itself is still pretty decent. It is going to be like another int faith-based option, which is nice. And it is unfortunately being compared to like the Sword of Night and Flame, which is like one of the most broken weapons in the entire game. But it is more fun though. Number 4, the Greatsword of RADAHN Lord. Now this is going to be the other Greatsword of RADAHN, basically identical to the Greatsword of RADAHN Light in every way. Same moveset, same range, damage, scalings, all identical, which is not a good thing because the Starscourge Greatsword basically gets the exact same moveset, just a bit less range, but just like way more damage, and actually gets a much better skill as well, because this skill, Promised Consort, does do this whole flurrying attack, which does get some nice amounts of hyper armor, can stagger those enemies pretty well, does rain down a bunch of these holy based pillars of light that do like next to no damage, and the entire combo can cost roughly 40 FP, which does seem like a lot, but you end up doing like a whole long combo because of that, so it does make sense. Now the reason why I prefer this one over the light version is because this one actually does do some decent damage. The combo can pair nicely with like the multi-hit talismans, and it can stagger enemies very well. Now unfortunately, those light projectiles do like no damage, so you are missing out on a whole bunch, but as I mentioned before, being that it's doing a holy damage, and gonna scale off that intelligence stat, you're gonna have to like change up your build and spec into intelligence, use things like the holy tier, the sacred scorpion charm, probably some more holy damaging buffs, and then go ahead and use the skill, and you'll notice that it does a lot more damage. So it can be viable that way, but you have all of these different buffs for holy damage, and your weapon is doing physical and magic damage. So when you actually want to end up using your light attack combos, the buffs that you're using, you're not going to benefit off. I don't know why this thing just didn't get like a faith-based scaling. Don't know why it doesn't get like a unique moveset. It could have just been split holy damage instead of split magic damage to begin with. I don't really know. There's so many things that could have been changed about this to make it actually good, but they just decided against it. Number 3, the Greatsword of Damnation. This is going to be a weapon that's more for PvP due to how the weapon skill actually does perform, but it is going to be a greatsword that does get some split holy damage, does scale best of strength, does also get somewhat of an okay faith scaling too. It does actually get the Claymore moveset, meaning that it is going to get the poking heavy attacks, which poking attacks are always amazing. They typically come out faster, maximize your range, and just do piercing damage, which is the best damage type in the game. But in terms of its weapon skill, for 21 FP, you do this cool jumping attack that does get a bunch of hyper armor and then comes slamming onto the ground. and it does actually perform as a grab attack, but only against NPCs. So really it's just going to be more useful in PvP. But the grab attack just guarantees a follow-up attack, which obviously is going to be really nice. Would have been really cool to have that in PvE. But yeah, unfortunately for PvE, when you land upon the ground, you do have to click an additional input for 10 FP to do that follow-up attack. And when you're on the ground, you get no hyper armor, so you actually can get staggered out of it before the follow-up attack actually does come out. And the first slam is actually kind of hard to aim and doesn't have that large of a hitbox. So there's a good chance that you completely miss, get staggered out of the follow-up attack, and just end up doing no damage. But this follow-up AoE actually does do really nice damage, does send smaller enemies flying up into the air. And the total combo can do a total of 33 stance damage. And best of all yet, it actually does scale off AR. You don't necessarily have to go all into Faith just to get good damage. Going into Strength is also going to boost the damage. So overall, it is a pretty solid weapon, but there are a couple of things holding it back. Number 2, the Sword Lance. This is actually the only Remembrance weapon in the entire game that actually can be infused. It actually is going to be your only heavy thrusting sword that does scale best with Strength, and actually gets a very good Strength scaling. And when going into a Strength build and two-handing, it actually is going to get more damage than all of the other heavy thrusting swords. But unfortunately, it just gets the worst moveset, because all of the heavy attacks are just identical to like the regular lance, which is going to be true for the running heavy attack and the regular heavy attack, which is just not that good because the regular heavy attack is going to be longer, is going to probably do a bit more damage, but the stance damage is identical. And the running heavy attack is just going to be way worse. Like the running heavy attack for the heavy thrusting swords is like the best running attack in the entire game. It covers so much distance so quickly and does some very solid damage. But then you trade that out for the running heavy attack of the lance, which is going to be better in terms of proccing the multi-hit talismans because it does hit multiple times and it can stun lock those smaller enemies. But if you're going up against like larger enemies that cannot get staggered, you're just going to be in that really long animation and it's going to be a lot more risky. And it's also going to do the same amount of stance damage, but just in a longer animation. But being that it is going to be a high damaging strength-based weapon, you can go into some certain types of fire-based skills. You can get some good damage out that way. I mean, all heavy thrusting swords get a lot of really good weapon skill options to begin with. So it's hard to go wrong, but there's not really many instances of which I would use this thing over other types of heavy thrusting swords. Number 1, the Spear of the Impaler, which I'm gonna be real, I don't even like this weapon like that, but it's still going to get number 1. That's how like mediocre these boss weapons are. But this weapon is going to be a great spear, which is nice, does get a good solid moveset. They do some nice stance damage, is going to do some split fire damage, actually gets more fire damage in physical, and gets a B scaling in dexterity and a C scaling in faith. But that C scaling in faith is actually much better than you think. It's kind of just as good as the B scaling you get in dexterity. So I recommend just going mainly into faith because that way you can just boost of just more spell damage too. Now this weapon also does get a unique heavy attack, and that is going to be a throwing projectile, which is going to perform very similar to the smithing types of weapons that get those unique throwing heavy attacks. And almost every single one of these things are just terrible. This one is going to be better than most of those other ones though. But it still gets really bad damage. It only gets 9 stance damage, which like the best way to proc stance breaks with these large weapons is going to be charged heavy attacks. And now you kind of just remove the only way of which you can proc a stance break really quickly. And you replaced it with like a very mediocre projectile that can do just as much damage as a light attack. Now it is going to be a free projectile heavy, so it's not going to be the worst thing in the world. But if you did want a cheap projectile option, there are lots of really efficient spells out there with faith-based types of builds, so you're better off just going with those. But the best part about this weapon is going to be its skill, Mesmer's Assault. For 15 FP, you become airborne, do this like cool swiping attack, which I don't know why the first couple of swings don't actually get a hitbox. It does like stagger smaller types of enemies, but it doesn't actually do damage. I don't know why. But the third swing actually does have a hitbox, does do some nice damage, lunges very far. And for an additional 9 FP, do this whole flowering attack that does actually work with the multi-hit talismans. And then for the final attack, does this massive like AoE explosion that can just do like monstrous amounts of damage. And against these smaller types of enemies that can get staggered or enemies weaker to fire damage, it is just going to mess them up completely. Now the obvious downside is that it is going to be a very long animation and it isn't like the easiest thing to control. So against certain enemies that are very quick or small, you might just miss. And with enemies with high amounts of poise damaging attacks, you are going to get staggered out of it as well because it does not get infinite hyper armor. Thankfully it does get some, but it definitely isn't impossible to get staggered out of. But yeah, that's kind of my overall thoughts of the weapon. Like it gets good damage. The skill is very high damaging, but being that it's a long animation, it's not going to be useful against like bosses that give you short openings, which most bosses in the DLC are just going to be like that. And the heavy attack that it gets just makes the weapon worse too. So yeah, it just like sits comfortably in the A tier. Anyway, that is the video now done and complete. Just let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. Hopefully it wasn't too negative for you. If you actually like any of these weapons, just use them. Don't take my opinion into account if you actually like a weapon. Don't come to me to seek validation because more likely than not, I'm not going to give it to you. But in terms of the next video, it's probably going to be a top 5 best builds video, and then we'll continue to rank some more weapons later on. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.